Welcome back to the daily Rambam class. It is Thursday. Let's start with a brief recap on where we are up to in the Rambam. We are learning the Rambam's Mishnah Torah of 40 volumes. We are up to volume number 10, Sefer Torah, with us backing 144 chapters, 8 subjects all in all. Let's have a look. Impurity of the dead, which we covered. Para Aduma, we've covered. And now we are learning the laws of Tzora'as, followed by some other sources of impurity, foods, vessels, and mikvahs. 16 chapters in Tzora'as, so we will be busy with this for approximately 2 weeks. Today we are on chapter 3. Before we get to chapter 3, this is just a breakdown. Did I not just say 16 chapters? I see there's only 15 here. What's going on? Yeah, this needs to be good. 14 to 16. So these are the 16 chapters of Tzora'as. The first 5 chapters deal with skin impure signs, forms of Tzora'as on the body. The next 2 chapters speak about pure signs on the body. Then signs on hairy parts of on the head where hair grows. Then examining the signs, a chapter on that. The laws of the Mitzvah, the person that becomes defiled. How does he need to go about things? How does he purify himself? And then finally we discuss Tzora'as on clothing and Tzora'as on buildings. That is a synopsis of the 16 chapters of Tzora'as that we are learning about at the moment. But for today, let's take a look at chapter 3. It's a short chapter. We're going to discuss very specifically amongst skin Tzora'as, there are 3 different signs. Hopefully by now you've learned. The one sign is when 2 white hairs grow in the middle. You learned about that, I imagine, yesterday. Another sign, which maybe you haven't yet learned about, is if the Tzora'as blemish spreads. If it spreads, that's a sign of impurity. And the third sign is if in the middle of this white spot on the person, there is a piece of fresh flesh, meaning that there's a white dot, and on that white dot in the middle there's a little bit of flesh that's not white, or that's natural color. That's the third sign of Tzora'as, or that's the third that I've just mentioned on skin. So again, skin Tzora'as is either by the growth of 2 hairs, or by the spreading of the blemish, or by having some fresh skin in the middle of the blemish. And that is what we are going to learn about today. We'll learn about the size, the position, the color, where it's if it's directly under Tzora'as or not, what grew first, what appeared first, and then a couple of scenarios, a few more scenarios on the size and position of Tzora'as. Let's take a look at the text. Halacha number 1. Flesh that heals is not considered as a sign of impurity unless it is the size of a lentil. That's pretty small. When a square is imposed upon it or more. How large is that? Enough for 4 hairs to grow, 2 lengthwise and 2 widthwise. So if you take your eyes and you really zoom in, so hairs grow in. Every hair actually has a little mound, if you could call it that, from which the hair grows. When you have a space that's large enough for 4 hairs to grow, a box of 4 hairs to grow on the skin, then that is, let's make it into a box, something like that, but obviously much smaller. Then that is the fresh skin in the middle of a Tzora'as that will make him impure. The flesh that heals must be the center of the Baheris. Baheris is a name for the white spot. So again, just to be clear, let's quickly put that on paper, on digital paper, on the whiteboard. We have in front of us a oh, this is going to be a little tricky because the whole screen is white. We need the background to change. Okay, we have over here. This is the person's hands. This is the person's hand. Okay. There's his fingers. Hope you appreciate my art. I'll be selling it after the class. And yeah, here's the person's hand, and on the hand, he has a Tzora'as spot. He's got a round white lesion in the middle of his hand. Well, in previous classes, you learned about what happens if some hair grows out in the middle, white hairs. Today we learn about how in the middle of this lesion there is another little dot. There's a dot within the dot. Something like that. Okay, it could really be a lot smaller than that. This is in real size. That makes tzora'as. Okay. If it was just all white, that's not yet tzora'as. It needs to be examined. We need to see, will this white circle spread? If it spreads, then we know it's tzora'as. If it doesn't spread, it's not. Or will two white hairs grow in it? Or third scenario, will there be a piece of fresh skin in the midst of this dot? If there is, it's tzora'as. Baheret is a way to refer to the white lesion. The Baheret must surround it on all sides, and there being a margin of the size of 2 hairs or more between the healthy flesh and the edge of Baheris. If, however, the healthy flesh is at the side of the Baheris, it is not a sign of impurity. So let's see that on paper. If the lesion was over here, well, let's make this all a little bit more real. The dot's a lot smaller. It's more like that. This is also a lot smaller. It's more like that. And here we are. Okay. Now, if it wasn't there, it wasn't in the middle, but instead it was like that, even though it's not touching the side, since there isn't enough space for 2 hairs to grow in this little gap over here, this is not tzora'as, and it will not make the person impure. Next scenario. If the healthy flesh was scattered in different places of the Baheret, for example, there was healthy flesh the size of a mustard seed, much less than a mustard seed is a lot smaller than a lintel. In one place, and healthy flesh the size of a mustard seed in another place, they are not combined to be considered as the size of a lentil, even though they are both in the midst of the same Baheris. Instead, there must be healthy flesh the size of a lintel when the square is imposed upon it or more in one place in the midst of the Baheris. So if you had instead a couple of little dots, a whole lot of them, like freckles. And if you add them all up together, they're going to be the size of a lintel, enough space for 2 hairs to go. This is not tzora'as because they're all over the place. You need to have all of the fresh skin in one spot, like this. Healthy flesh imparts impurity regardless of its shade. It can be red, black, or white, provided it is not one of the 4 shades of whiteness that we described. So this little dot in the middle can be any color, provided it's not white. If it's one of the 4 shades of white that deem something tzora'as, then it's no good. Otherwise, it still is tzora'as and will make the person impure. Flesh that healed is not a sign of impurity unless it is in the baheres itself. So now what we're going to say is, let's first read it inside. What is implied? In the midst of the baheres, meaning that white spot, that white lesion, there was a boil, burned flesh, or a healed boil or burned flesh, or a bayhek, and there was totally healthy skin in the midst of these abnormal skin features. Even though the healthy flesh is in the midst of the baheres, it is not a sign of impurity, because it is within the boil, within the burnt flesh, within the bayak, within the healed flesh. It's not directly on the white spot. Similarly, if a boil or its healed flesh, burnt flesh, or its healed flesh, or a bayak surrounds the healthy flesh, or one of these abnormal skin features is directly next to the healthy flesh at its side, or one of these abnormal skin features divides the healthy flesh and enters within it, it is not a sign of impurity. It is like a baheres that does not have any sign of impurity, and the person should be isolated to see if anything happens. Let's draw a few of these scenarios. Hands on. So we have over here our piece of fresh skin. But instead of it going straight onto the tzora'as, there was a scar sitting over there, and on top of that scar, you've got your let's try this again. It's running away. You have a scar, and on top of that scar, you've got your, anyhow, I think you get the idea. You have a scar, and on top of the scar, you have your healthy flesh. It is not a sign of impurity. Why? Because it's not directly on the tzora'as. It has to be directly on the tzora'as in order to be impure. But if it is on top of it, then it is not tzora'as. Or another scenario is if this scar or healed flesh is on its side over there. Again, it's not a sign of impurity because it needs to be directly on the white. If there's something bordering one of its sides, if there's something bordering one of its sides, then it's not considered directly on the white dot. Or another scenario, move this guy away. If there was a line going down the middle of the scar, since it has now divided the fresh skin into two, it is also not a sign of impurity. Rather, we'll consider it as if that whole middle, everything going on in the middle is non-existent, and we will wait to see if there are any other signs of impurity. Is that clear? Yes.
Yeah.
If the boil, the burnt flesh, or the bayak in which the healthy flesh was found, that was at its side, that surrounded or that entered, it disappeared, and as the healthy flesh alone was found within the baheres at the end of the first week or the end of the second week, the person should be deemed definitively impure, tameh. If they did not depart, he should be released for the process of inspection. So if you do have the scenario that we've just described, where there is, for example, some kind of scar of sorts on the side, so then we wait. If at the end of the week it disappears, then the person is impure. If it remained, then the person, after being examined for 2 weeks, is dismissed as pure after our 2-week examination period. If he does not have a disqualifying feature, then he is deemed free to go. Moving along. Healthy flesh is always a sign of impurity, whether the healthy flesh existed before the Baharis or the Baharis existed before the healthy flesh. Because concerning it, the Torah does not state and it turned. Although the Torah does state and it turned hair to white, and there was healthy flesh in this Tzora'as, there's no need for a blemish to have both white hair and healthy flesh. Instead, each one independently is a sign of impurity. They were mentioned together only to identify the measure of healthy flesh that imparts impurity, enough to contain enough white hair to cause a person to be deemed impure, i.e. 2 hairs. So, regardless of whether first you had the white circle and then you had the dots, or whether first you had the dots and then you had the white circle grow up around it, either way, it is a sign of impurity. So we've looked at the size and position, the color, it needs to be directly on the side. The order is irrelevant, and in the next 5 halachas, we're going to discuss more scenarios that are all pretty much focused on the first point, which is the exact sizes of the white dots and of the fresh flesh in the middle and their positioning. Let's take a look at the next 5 halachas. When a Baharis is exactly the size of a gris, and in its midst there's a healthy flesh exactly the size of a lentil. So they're both the exact minimum measurements. The afflicted person is definitely impure. He is deemed definitely impure. If the size of the Baharis or the size of the healthy flesh was diminished, he is pure. Similarly, if the size of the healthy flesh of this Baharis increased, he is also pure. The rationale is that a Baharis is not in part impurity because of healthy flesh unless it has a margin of afflicted flesh, the width of 2 hairs on every side. If the healthy flesh was less than a lentil and then it increased until it reached the size of a lentil, the afflicted person should be deemed definitely impure. If the size of the healthy flesh then diminished or disappeared, the status returns to its initial state and there's no sign of impurity. Pretty obvious, but the one scenario I'll spell out. So if this white dot became smaller, so then it's already not the minimum size. If it's less than the minimum size, then it's obviously pure. Or in another scenario, if the white spot was nice and big, and you had inside of it that spot of fresh skin, but then this spot increased. If this spot increased, even though there's just been added growth in the area of Tzora'as, he is now pure. Why? Because now he no longer has enough space for 2 hairs to grow all the way around the margin. So you need to have a reasonable margin between the fresh skin and the white skin. Final scenario, if this became really small, then it becomes pure. If it's smaller than the minimal amount, if it subsequently became bigger, then it becomes impure once again. So we continuously judge things at where they are at that moment. If a Baharis is larger than a gris and it contains healthy flesh that is larger than a lentil, the afflicted person is impure whether they increase or decrease in size, provided the size of the Baharis does not decrease to less than a gris, the size of the healthy flesh does not decrease to less than a lentil. And the healthy flesh that does not come within 2 handments of the edge of the Baharis, as we explained. This sounds very self-explanatory. It's just in the previous halacha, he described where everything was exact measurement. But he's saying if it's not exact measurement, if everything's a lot bigger, then you have a larger margin of error. So if the Tzora'as is that big, then obviously, even if it gets a lot smaller, he's still impure, provided that it's not too small. Provided that it's not too small, he has purity. Obviously, once it gets too small, he'll be pure. And the same with this dot. If this dot was nice and big, then even if it gets smaller, he's still impure, provided that it is still within measurement. And then again, with regards to the margin, if this was a lot bigger, then even if the dot in the middle did get bigger, it's still fine, provided there's a margin. Only once it gets so big that there's no longer a margin of sufficient size does he become pure. When the Maharis is the size of a grist, and there is healthy flesh the size of a lentil or surrounding it, not in it, but surrounding it, from the outside, and a second Maharis surrounding the healthy flesh. The inner Maharis would cause the affected person to be isolated, for it does not have a sign of impurity in it. The outer Maharis causes it to be deemed definitely impure because there is a healthy flesh in its midst. If the healthy flesh that was between the two blemishes was diminished or disappeared entirely, whether it was diminished or reduced from the inside or was diminished from the outside, the two are considered as one Maharis that does not have a sign of impurity. Let us spell this out. So here what you actually have is, you have this. You have a white dot, and then in the white dot there is fresh skin. And then inside of that fresh skin, there is another white dot. Like that. So now, with regards to the inside white dot, although it has fresh skin around it, that doesn't impurify it, right? A white dot only becomes impure if it has fresh skin in it. So this white dot really is left to wait to see if any hairs or fresh skin will develop within it. But the person is still deemed impure because of the outer white dot, because the outer white dot does have fresh skin inside of it, albeit with white inside of it. If subsequently the fresh skin disappears like that, then he's obviously not impure, because there is no longer a sign of impurity within his white dot. Okay. When a Maharis is located at the tip of the limbs and there is healthy flesh in its midst at the tip, it is not considered as a sign of impurity. Why? Because the healthy flesh divides the blemish into two. Thus, one portion streams down one side of the limb and the other portion streams down the other. The person is not deemed impure because the Torah says, and the priest shall see it. He shall see it all at once as a single entity is what is implied. So I'm not going to draw that up because that might challenge my drawing skills on whiteboard digital. But if on his hand, he has a white dot right at the tip, not supposed to demonstrate bad things. But sometimes Tzora'as, the Rebbe in Chassidus, it explains the reason we don't have Tzora'as today is because Tzora'as was when the person on the inside was in such a good space that there was just some kind of fault on the very external part of himself, perhaps in his words, but on the inside he was really good. So then that would surface. But today we're not on the spiritual level because we've also got inner evils, and therefore we don't merit to have the miracle of Tzora'as appear upon us. So anyhow, if the person had Tzora'as on his fingertip, so although there is flesh skin in the middle, since the flesh skin is right in the middle, when you look at it, especially from the camera right now, you're not able to see the whole white dot because it's going in different sides. So that will not make the person impure. What are the 24 tips of the limbs that do not impart impurity when healthy flesh is found upon them? The tips of the fingers, that's 10, and the toes is another 10. Where are we holding at? 30? No, 20. The tips of the ear and the nose, so we're now at 23. I believe 2 ears, 1 nose. Have I got that right? Who knows? The tip of the corona of the male organ and the tips of a woman's breast. Those are the 24 tipping points. The tips of a man's breast, warts and blisters by contrast, do impart impurity if there's a beheris and unhealthy flesh found upon them, they're not considered as a tipping point. When there is a flat surface the size of a gris at the tip of any of these limbs, so if for whatever reason they were flattened, maybe a person had a very big finger, so just on the tip of the finger itself was quite a large surface. And a blemish does impart impurity. If they were found round, as is the case for most people, then it would be impure. What is implied? If there's a beheris the size of a gris at the tip of one's nose or the tip of one's finger, descending to either direction, he is pure, as implied by the phrase that the priest shall see it. Implied is that you see the entire blemish as a single entity, which is not the case if it's rounded, as opposed to if it was for whatever reason flat, and he was able to see the whole thing in one space, then the person would be deemed impure. Thank you so much for joining, and wishing you a clean Shabbos, filled with only good words to say about your fellow.
About the test.
Oh, the test. Okay. Question number 1. When is healthy skin a sign of impurity? Healthy skin, sign of impurity. When a beheris appears around an area of healthy skin, when it forms after a beheris appears, or either of the above cases?
Number 3.
Number 3. Yeah.
Correct. Question number 2. When healthy skin forms within a boil, that is in the midst of a beheris, is it a sign of impurity?
No.
No.
Correct. Got it again. In the above scenario, what is the law if the boil beneath the healthy skin goes away? Then the healthy skin does become a sign of impurity, or even though the boil went away, the healthy skin is not a sign of impurity, or the healthy skin is no longer a sign of impurity because the boil went away.
Number 1.
Number one.
Don't ask me what the difference between 2 and 3 are. Question number 4. If there are small patches of healthy skin in a beheris, do they combine to be a sign of impurity? If they would combine to be the size of a lintel, then yes. If 2 hairs could grow in each patch, and together they would combine to be the size of a lintel, yes or no?
No.
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 Correct. Well done. You've earned yourself knowledge of God's infinite wisdom and unity with thousands of Jews around the world. Wishing you a wonderful Shabbos.